Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've made it to the last lecture in the series of African political thought. Well done for putting up with my attempts to explain a few things from my point of view of African political thought. And of course, I look forward to reading your own views of African political thought. Thank you for your feedback at all times. It's been constructive, it's been probing, and I've really learned a lot from you, both in class and also, of course, in individual consultations. So very, very happy to have had you in my class, and as I say, thank you for being such wonderful students. We are going to conclude the series today by looking at the future of political thought as it addresses certain things. Now, last week, we looked at the lack of thought to do with essentially the psychological health of Africa. In other words, the endurance and the coming through, the emergence from trauma, something which is occasioned not just by wars of liberation, but in terms of the difficulties of being able to emerge from underdevelopment, trauma induced simply by want, by hunger, by things that are elemental, but all the same have a major impact on one's capacity to act thoughtfully as a citizen. So all of these things are interrelated, and we discuss the role and the desirability of law, particularly constitutionalized provision, that ensured certain rights for the citizens so that a certain balance of life could be exercised in society, in civil society, and indeed in political society. We're going to continue some of these themes today, but looking in particular not only at constitutional provision, but at constitutional provision on not only a national but a continental scale. And we're going to be looking also at whether or not there exists a great deal of thought in terms of the scientific progress of Africa. Now, the question of scientific progress is very much occasioned by the death in the last few days of John Magufuli, the president of Tanzania, and he was a notorious COVID denier in the sense that he regarded vaccinations as unnecessary, regarded it very, very much in terms of a certain rhetoric that had made him very popular throughout Africa, particularly among young people, regarded vaccination as an imperial tool of the West, and at the same time suggesting that another imperial tool of the West from more historical times, Christianity, could be the cure of COVID, praying, faith, and that these would overcome the effects of infection. They could even prevent infection entirely. Of course, he was wrong. And the rumors that he himself died of not just heart complications, basically a heart attack, but a heart weakened, so the rumors say, by COVID, may or may not be poetic justice. I would decline to make that kind of statement. It's unfair. We've got no grounding at this stage, no evidence to say that. But certainly some ironies abound in the speculation as to his death. Of course, what you have is the ascension to the presidency of the former vice president. She becomes Africa's first Islamic female president. She took the oath of office on the Quran, and she's a breakthrough in more ways than one. And if this is the legacy of Magufuli, that a breakthrough of this sort has been achieved, well, that is only to the good. What her stand on COVID would be, we at this stage don't know. But it's very, very strange in the case of Magufuli, because although he never used the title, in fact, he had a PhD in chemistry. So one would have thought that he was scientifically aware and scientifically alert. It wasn't a PhD in law or political science, for instance, but in a stem cell subject. And the triumph of a rhetoric of anti-Western imperialism, neocolonialism, and a rhetoric to do with Christian belief somehow triumphed over any kind of reference to a proper, sober, balanced scientific appraisal of what was going on in terms of the particular pandemic, which, if we had figures, has certainly swept through Tanzania. It has done for a number of very senior people in the Tanzanian political establishment. The vice president of Zanzibar went just a short time before Magufuli himself died. So it provides a moment for taking stock, and the taking stock basically proposes that all of these years after the dream of an Africa that was independent and united, you still have two major characteristics. The dream survives in the sense of people guarding their nationalisms, and this prevents, it hinders to a significant extent, a true internationalism of Africa, that is bringing all 54 countries of Africa together. The idea of national sovereignty and independence from any supranational intervention remains very, very strong all of these years after independence. So what prospect for unity, or what even any prospect for a unity based on subscription to common institutions, particularly those institutions that might be able to intervene in the so-called sovereign affairs of individual states and their nationalisms. So the thought of creating nations and nation states, basically the entire driving force for independence against colonialism, that is a particular approach to politics that remains in Africa today. The other thing, in terms of how to conceive of an African Renaissance, and people have been talking about this for a very, very long time, an African culture that could stand up in the face of the world's cultures and be regarded as not only equal, but influencing the world's other cultures. That remains strong, and to a certain extent, when you look at the work of Thabo Mbeki, the last great apostle of an African cultural renaissance, he looked to a political renaissance in terms of independence from the West, but essentially he was talking about a cultural renaissance. It harks back to the negritude of people like Senghor, people who are often described as francophonic to a fault and middle class in their orientations to the point of being elitist. But all the same, the idea of a proposition to do with African culture being dominant in aspirations, a centerpiece of African aspirations, that can't just be dismissed as a middle-class idealistic trope. So what you had in terms of a lineage, Senghor to Mbeki, through people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o with his emphasis on indigenous languages and creativity in those languages, what you have is something cultural and not scientific. So that the idea of an African identity that is proud and independent is expressed in terms to do with culture, certainly. It's expressed in terms to do with nationalisms that should not be impeded, not even by other African nations, states, and institutions, certainly. It fails to deal with issues of scientific progress. And I make this point, I've made this point in a number of other broadcasts for other sectors of the intellectual world, and that is when you look at the vaccine that is in fact required for Africa right now, people like John Magufuli notwithstanding, 4 members of the Zimbabwean cabinet have died, for instance, from COVID. Then one asks the question, it's not just a question of procurement of someone else's vaccine, whether it's the Sinopharm, whether it's the Sputnik, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, whatever. I've given detailed presentations on this in other fora. The question that comes to my mind is, why can't Africa make a vaccine? In other words, all of these years of independence and no investment into scientific and medical research of the sort required to put a continent on its feet in health terms. It's true that you have now the Director General of WHO, who's African and Ethiopian. It's also true that you've probably got a small but very evident number of centers which could, if encouraged, pursue, probably successfully, research into vaccine development and production. Ethiopia itself, Egypt, South Africa. You've got these possible centers where all the same the governments have not been devoted to the idea of funding research for this kind of key aspect that would facilitate development, facilitate the health of the citizen body. And this has been going on for some time. I remember in 2012, I helped to open the 8th African Development Forum. I gave one of the speeches at one of the meetings that was held to lead up to the formal states heads participation in the opening. But my particular meeting was a technical one. In other words, how do we plan for the future of Africa in the forthcoming development decade? And none of the papers were to do with scientific progress. This really struck me as a lack of thought and a lack of foresight and a lack of political commitment. In short, a lack of political thought on this question. In other words, Africa as recipient, and Africa as recipient in a way which is embarrassing enough for a president like John Magufuli to begin to describe it in terms of imperialism. So rather than accept assistance, he would reject imperialism. Now, this is a combination of dangerous thought, but as I say, it begs the question, well, why can't you develop your own vaccine? A country like Cuba is on the verge of doing so, because ever since the days of Fidel, excoriated by the Americans and placed, of course, his country was placed in sanctions by the United States of America, the Cubans since that time have concentrated a very great deal of energy on medical development. They send doctors around the world, including to Africa. They've got very, very advanced facilities for scientific and medical research. And if they say they're on the verge of developing their own vaccine, then, as I think I've said before to you, I believe that they can and that they will. In other words, the example of countries like Cuba, certainly of India, the world's greatest producer of vaccines today, so AstraZeneca is to a large extent made under license in India, for instance, alongside Indian homegrown vaccines. That kind of imagination that Africa can do that is lacking in the leadership, in the political thought, and in the philosophical thought of African intellectuals today. Still very, very much, even in very, very progressive and groundbreaking thought, such as that by Sabelo and Ndlovu Gatsheni, now the University of Bayreuth in Germany, but a leading professor coming from the southern part of Africa, very much emphasizing the need, the desirability for, and the creation of an African self-epistemology. In other words, not to rely on Western thought, for the definition of one's own self and one's own truth and one's own truthful orientation to the world and how one expresses meaning in the world. Basically an extremely sophisticated development of what Ngugi was talking about in his essay, Decolonizing the Mind. The irony again, and he's a good friend of mine, and I've pointed this out to him. At one stage, we were going to do a book of, not interviews, but a book of debate between the two of us. This might still come. And of course, my proposition in any would-be debate is, well, okay, if you develop your own epistemology, first of all, how do you have an epistemology that accommodates science? This was something that Ngugi failed to answer. And how do you have an epistemology that is entirely, authentically, even perhaps autochthonously African, that can then talk to other epistemologies? And by that I don't just mean talk on equal terms, albeit possibly with the need for philosophical translation, between Africa and Europe, between Africa and the West in general, but between Africa and India, Africa and China. If the world is one of almost hermetically sealed epistemologies in terms of the renaissance of development, what is the meaning of this in terms of communications, in building a global commons? In other words, every proposition comes with difficulties in its execution and in terms of its consequences. That this should be something that is pursued is without doubt, because it proposes alternatives and antidotes to prevailing and hegemonic ways of thinking. At some point in time, however, the moment of coalescence, of common cause, is very, very important. And of course, the point about how do you express yourself in scientific terms. And Ngugi at one point in time pointed out a Cornell, University of Cornell in New York State, PhD thesis on chemistry, which was written in Kikuyu, and basically saying, look, this shows it can be done. Well, I'm one of these people who then goes off and accesses the PhD thesis in question. And the number of loan words that had to be used in the thesis in order to render it scientific was such that it raised the very key question: if Kikuyu language as it stands does not have a scientific vocabulary, from where will the scientific vocabulary come? So that at the highest and most technical, at dense terminologies, dense formulaic expressions, what is the global commons that cannot be avoided? So these are questions that thought in Africa has yet to answer. There are other thought questions that need to be answered, and I said last week I would deal very, very much with questions to do with the African Union and its thought in terms of some kind of continental commons, in terms of justice, in terms of respect for law within the individual states of the African Union, and very, very much in terms of being able to safeguard the peace in member states of the African Union. All of these pose all kinds of problems, and none of which, and I am going to say this, none of which have attracted what I would call advanced levels of thought. So that you have a major, I think, improvement with the formation of the African Union at the turn of the millennium. It's been given the capacity, on paper at least, to do much more than its predecessor Organization for African Unity, the OAU, which all the same was itself a breakthrough because there were so many arguments and competing groups with different visions as to what the Organization for African Unity should be able to do. So the African Union has been able to overcome a great many of those fissures, but at the same time, although on paper it is empowered to do a number of things, has not yet done them. And one of these things that it is concerned about, but has not done anything about, is to do with questions of the transparency and the fairness of leadership selection and ascension to leadership in African countries, in member states. Now, the situation in Africa has gone through a history of being dire, so that since the moment of independence, starting with Ghana in 1957, leading up to 2001, the year of the creation of the African Union, then 48 of the states in sub-Saharan Africa, and we're not counting North Africa, countries like Egypt, for instance, had long been underneath military government of one sort or another. But of the sub-Saharan states, from independence up to 2001, of those 48 states, 80 successful and 108 failed coup attempts had taken place. Now, that's quite a number of coups or attempted coups for every member of the African Union. Of course, not all of them suffered coups, but the number of coups, even if repeated in one particular state, Nigeria, for instance, has gone through a number of military governments, Ghana, as we've discussed, etc., etc. The idea of forcible replacement of government without necessarily any citizen agreement or approval or mechanism for approval that is not militarized. In other words, you're going to vote to accept the new government because you've got a gun in your face. None of that meets any test of free and fair approval. So the idea of being able to have forcible changes of government without reflecting necessarily the popular will, or at least being able to subject the change of government to any test, free, fair, and unhindered by threat of the popular will, now that is something which the African Union has not been able to deal with. Of course, the number of coups has diminished in recent years. There are different ways of being authoritarian now, using, for instance, the mechanism of elections, and of course the ingenious scientific means of rigging an election. As I said, using algorithms now has become very, very sophisticated. All of that kind of thing has not brought any response from the African Union, so that you can always pick out the African Union observers at elections, not just because they wear uniform gilet and badges, but because they don't do anything. And they certainly don't come armed with computers. They're there pretty much to say that the election was observed. And on polling day, they make a tour of a number of polling stations and say that everything is in order. But of course, everything is in order on polling day. The disorder, in terms of the fairness of the election, was set up a long time before they arrived. And of course, in terms of the execution of the count at the highest levels, using computer-adjusted result mechanisms, none of which the African Union is able to grapple with. And of course, the African Union comes with a slow start. The previous, we would call it a Director General, they call it the chair of the Commission of the African Union. The previous chair, before the current one is Musa Faki Mohammed, but before him it was Madam Dlamini Zuma, the former wife of Jacob Zuma. She was put into place as a result of a South African power play, despite the fact that there were probably, in my opinion, better qualified candidates, and in fact the tenure of Dlamini Zuma was, in my opinion, a disaster. When he became her successor, because she went home after one term, she was hoping to contest the leadership of the ANC, many thought, so that she could protect her former husband. And she was very much an opponent of the current South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, who all the same has put her in his cabinet, both because he needed the numbers, both because of that, and she came from political genealogy, political royalty. And also, of course, it's easier to control somebody when they're inside rather than outside. So she retains leverage in South African politics, but she certainly had no leverage in the African Union. Very little happened, although a number of declarations were passed. But when Musa Faki Mohammed became the chair of the Commission of the African Union, the first thing he said was, look, I've got to replace the entire IT. And nothing's been done to maintain, upgrade this. It's not fit for purpose. We actually can't communicate our message to the outside world, not with the outside world beyond Africa and not with Africa itself. The sophisticated mechanisms that are required, not only for communication, but what it is we wish to communicate, that is the electronic capacity to data crunch, that is not there in the African Union that I am inheriting. And this was neglected by Dlamini Zuma as an exact mirror of the neglect of that by the ANC governments, successive governments in South Africa. It was only recently that you could actually count a majority of the South African cabinet that could actually use email. And something as simple as that. And I think I've said to you the joke about carrier pigeons in South Africa being able to carry a message from one city to another faster than it took for a download to be unpacked, opened, sent from one city to another. A scientific download with very, very dense material in it. Put it into a memory stick, strap it to a pigeon, the pigeon will get there first. And the great missing ingredient in the triumph of liberation after the years of apartheid, the great missing ingredient was, well, where do we go from here in terms of scientific development? Where do we go even in terms of medical development? So that the South African research laboratories, the medical schools with their research laboratories, were certainly able to pick up quite quickly the South African variant of the COVID virus and warn the world about the nature of this variant. They were just as fast as here in Great Britain picking up the English variant that originated in the southern part of the country. So you have, as it were, that kind of capacity, but there has not been the kind of investment, as I said, that would have been required, so that people with the knowledge of medical research methodologies and technologies could have actually developed a vaccine of South Africa's own. So this lack of thought basically not only impedes progress, it continues, it facilitates the continuation of what Magufuli was complaining about, but complaining about it in wrongful rhetorical terms, the continuation of dependence on other providers. So what I'm saying today is that a truly independent Africa has got to be one that can be scientific. That is not something that is going to cut a lot of ice with a lot of leaders who are the same, despite the fact that coups have gone down, tinkering with constitutions, ensuring they get not just 2 terms as president, but 3, perhaps more, trying to ensure that they have a longevity in power, that the presidency has more power than it had before, and that the trope, our turn to eat, although not as naked as the case of Kenya in 2007, nevertheless becomes a trope that is applied to the enrichment, the access not only to political power, but the access to material wealth, to financial wealth, to ownership, not necessarily production, but ownership, its acquisition, pure and proper, neo-patrimonialism without forces of production. Here, the Marxist critique falls down. If there's no production, you've actually got a problem in terms of your theory. What you've got in terms of this ownership, this neo-patrimonialism, this need not only to